If you really want to know the truth, there's nothing phonier than a family New Year's party. It's all forced smiles and people pretending they aren't miserable. It's depressing as hell. I'm Daisy Wagner. I just became a chief medical supervisor, but my parents were too busy drooling over my sister's fiancé, a guy who acted like a big shot but sweated like a thief. They treated me like a total failure just to impress a fraud. It kills me, it really does. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Anyway, I was sitting in my car just dreading the walk to the front door. The silence inside my beat-up sedan was the first moment of peace I'd had in 36 hours. I sat in my parents' driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the house I grew up in. It was New Year's Eve and the house was lit up like a runway at O'Hare. My father had wrapped every shrub railing and gutter in twinkling white lights, a display that screamed prosperity to the neighbors while quietly driving up the electric bill he constantly complained about. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes, the phantom beep of heart monitors still echoing in my ears. My feet were swollen, my eyes felt like they were packed with sand, and I smelled faintly of antiseptic soap and cafeteria coffee. But none of that mattered. I had done it. The email was sitting in my inbox unread by anyone but me, Dr. Daisy Wagner, Chief Residency Supervisor. Passed the boards, secured the promotion. I wasn't just a resident anymore. Come Monday, I was the boss. I took a deep breath, inhaling the cold December air seeping through the vents, and grabbed my bag. I was ready for a glass of wine and just maybe a "good job, Daisy" from the people who raised me. The moment I opened the front door, I was assaulted by the smell of potpourri and anxiety. The hallway was cluttered with coats, but not family coats. These were guest coats, even though the guest of honor hadn't arrived yet. My mother, Sheila, came barreling out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that looked brand new. She didn't look at my face. She looked at my shoes. "Daisy, thank goodness. You're late. Take your shoes off. We just had the carpets shampooed for tonight. And for heaven's sake, don't sit on the good sofa in those scrubs." That was the greeting. No hug. No, "How was the shift?" Just a command about upholstery. I kicked off my sneakers, fighting the urge to mention that my scrubs were actually clean because I'd changed before leaving the hospital, a habit drilled into me during rounds. "Hi, Mom," I said, forcing a smile as I walked into the kitchen. "Happy New Year. I actually have some news." She cut me off by shoving a silver tray of bacon-wrapped dates into my hands. "Tell me later. Right now, I need these on the coffee table. Brad will be here any minute. Make sure the napkins are fanned out, Daisy. Fanned out, not just in a stack. Presentation is everything." I walked into the living room, tray in hand, feeling less like a doctor and more like hired help. My father, Frank, was standing by the fireplace, adjusting a tie that looked too tight. He was sweating despite the house being kept at a glacial temperature. He looked me up and down, his expression souring slightly. "You couldn't have worn a dress?" he asked, taking a date from the tray I was holding. "Chloe's wearing a dress. Brad is wearing a suit. You look like you just came from, well, work." I set the tray down, fanning the napkins with aggressive precision. "I did come from work, Dad. A 36-hour shift. Actually, that's what I wanted to tell you guys. The board results came in. I'm officially—" My father waved a hand, dismissing the sentence before it could land. Yes, the doctor thing. We know, Daisy. You've been in school for 100 years. Look, just try not to talk about the gore tonight. Okay, Brad is a man of vision. He's in finance. High-level stuff. He doesn't need to hear about gallbladders while he's drinking champagne." The sting was sharp, familiar, and old. It was the same feeling I'd had 6 months ago during my graduation ceremony. I had walked across the stage, the culmination of 4 years of grueling undergrad and 4 years of medical school, scanning the crowd for my parents. They weren't there. They were 3 hours away, helping my sister Chloe move into a slightly larger apartment because she couldn't handle the stress alone. I had eaten dinner by myself that night at a diner near the campus, wearing my cap and gown because I didn't want to take them off yet. Now, standing in their living room, the memory of that cold diner toast burned in my chest. "Brad is in finance. I asked, keeping my voice level. I thought Chloe said he worked at a hospital. My father poured himself a drink, his hand shaking slightly. Medical finance, Daisy. The business side. The side that makes money. Unlike you, drowning in those student loans. You know, I was telling your mother it's a shame you didn't meet someone like Brad. He's going to take care of Chloe. He's going to take care of things. He's a visionary. We're hoping he can give us some advice on the second mortgage. There it was. The naked truth wrapped in an insult. They didn't care about the title or the hard work. They cared that I came with a bill, and Chloe's fiancé came with a checkbook. I was the investment that hadn't paid off yet. Before I could respond, Chloe swept into the room. She looked stunning. I had to admit, in a red velvet dress that probably cost more than my first car, her hair done up in complicated curls. But her eyes were manic. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and dragged me into the hallway away from our parents. "Daisy, listen to me," she hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. "Brad is almost here. You need to do me a favor." She looked around to make sure Mom wasn't listening. "Don't talk about being a doctor tonight." I blinked, pulling my arm back. "What, Chloe? I am a doctor. It's literally my job." Chloe rolled her eyes, a gesture she'd perfected in high school. I know. But Brad, he's very successful. He's practically running the administration at St. Jude's. It might intimidate him if you start trying to act smart. Men don't like it when you try to one-up them with science words. Just tone it down. Maybe say you're looking for work, or that you're a nurse, or just unemployed. I stared at her. The request was so absurd, so deeply insulting, that my brain actually paused to process it. She wanted me to erase the last decade of my life so her boyfriend wouldn't feel insecure. She wanted the chief residency supervisor to play the role of the family failure so the rich fiancé could shine. I looked at Chloe's desperate face, then back at my father in the living room, anxiously checking his watch and muttering about interest rates. They wanted a narrative where Chloe was the princess and I was the cautionary tale. They wanted a savior in a shiny suit. A cold, hard knot of determination formed in my stomach. If they wanted a show, I would give them a show. I would give them exactly what they asked for, and I would let them sit in it until it rotted. A slow smile spread across my face, terrifyingly calm. "Okay, Chloe," I said softly. "You got it. I won't say a word about the promotion. In fact, I won't mention being a doctor at all. I'll just be Daisy, the unemployed burden." Chloe clapped her hands, oblivious to the danger in my tone. "Oh, thank you. You're the best. Just let him talk, okay? He loves to talk about his work." "I bet he does," I murmured, turning back toward the living room as the doorbell rang. "I can't wait to hear all about it." The front door swung open to reveal the man who was supposedly going to save the Wagner family from financial ruin, and my first thought was that our savior had a perspiration problem. Brad stood on the welcome mat, flanked by the winter darkness, wearing a suit that was a shade of blue, so bright it seemed to vibrate. It was shiny polyester shiny, not silk shiny, and tight across the shoulders in a way that suggested he hadn't exhaled since leaving his car. "Happy New Year," he boomed, stepping inside and bringing a gust of freezing air with him. He thrust a bottle of wine toward my father like he was knighting him. "A little something from the private reserve. You can't get this in stores." I glanced at the label as my father cradled it like a holy relic. Cuvée de l'ombre. I knew it well. They sold it at the 24-hour pharmacy near the hospital for $9. It was the private reserve of people who needed a drink at 3:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Brad, you shouldn't have," my mother gushed, practically hip-checking me out of the way to take his coat. As she hung it up, I peered out the side window at the vehicle idling in the driveway. It was a black luxury sedan, sleek and expensive, exactly the kind of car a medical financier would drive. But as the headlights of a passing car swept over it, I saw the telltale barcode sticker on the rear passenger window. Fleet rental. enterprise or hurts. I turned back to Brad, who was currently gripping my father's hand in a dominance display that made my dad wince. "And this must be Daisy?" Brad asked, turning his gaze on me. He looked me up and down, his eyes glazing over the moment they registered my lack of jewelry and my comfortable shoes. "Chloe mentioned you. You're the student still. Something like that," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Nice to meet you, Brad. I hear you're in administration." He laughed, a loud barking sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Administration is a small word for what I do, Daisy. I'm in ops, strategic oversight, keeping the wheels turning at St. Jude's." My stomach did a little flip. St. Jude's. He had said it out loud. He was claiming to run the very building where I had spent the last 4 years sleeping in on-call rooms and memorizing patient charts. We moved to the dining room, where the table was set with the good china, the plates we weren't even allowed to look at when I was a kid. I was directed to the seat at the far end near the kitchen door, the spot usually reserved for children or disgraced relatives. Chloe and Brad sat opposite my parents, forming a united front of success. As my mother ladled out the soup, a lobster bisque that was definitely beyond their budget, the interrogation began. But it wasn't directed at Brad. It was directed at me for Brad's benefit. "So, Daisy," my father started buttering a roll aggressively, "have you thought about what you're going to do now? I mean, really do. You can't live like a student forever." I blew on my soup, keeping my eyes down. "I'm working on it, Dad. Things are progressing." Chloe chimed in, resting her hand on Brad's forearm. "Daisy has a lot of loans, Brad, like a scary amount. We try not to talk about it, but it's hard when she's always asking for help." I nearly choked. I hadn't asked my parents for a dime in 6 years. In fact, I had sent them money last Christmas to fix the furnace. "Loans are a killer," Brad said, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "That's why I went straight into the market. ROI, you know. Return on investment. Doctors. No offense, Daisy, but they're service workers, high-paid mechanics. The real power is in the structure. The money flows up." My mother nodded vigorously, as if he had just explained the theory of relativity. "Exactly. That's what we always tell her. Daisy, you should listen to Brad. He's looking at buying a boat this summer. A boat, imagine that." She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "Maybe Brad can look at your resume. See if there's something in filing or reception." I gripped my spoon until my knuckles turned white. They were flaying me alive, stripping away my accomplishments to make this man feel taller. "I don't think I'm qualified for Brad's world," I said, my voice tight. "It sounds very complex." Brad preened, leaning back in his chair and unbuttoning his jacket. "It is. It's high stress. Just last week I had to let a senior physician go, Dr. Henderson. Nice guy, but he wore these atrocious Crocs to a board meeting. I told him, 'Doc, you represent the brand. If the shoes don't fit the culture, you don't fit the payroll.' Had security walk him out within the hour." The table went silent in awe. My parents looked at him like he was a god of justice. But I froze. The spoon stopped halfway to my mouth. Dr. Henderson. There was no Dr. Henderson at St. Jude's. But there was a janitor named Henderson, old Mr. Henderson. And he hadn't been fired last week. He had retired with a cake and a gold watch. And the atrocious Crocs, Henderson had a foot condition. The story Brad was telling it was a twisted, aggrandized version of a break room rumor I had heard nurses laughing about 3 days ago. A cold clarity washed over me. Brad wasn't an executive. He wasn't even middle management. He was a nobody. He was listening to gossip in the cafeteria and repurposing it to sound important to his girlfriend's parents. Executives don't know the janitor's shoe drama. Schedulers do. Junior admins do. The people who sit in the cubicles next to the break room do. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the faint sheen of sweat on his upper lip, the way his eyes darted around the room when he wasn't speaking, checking to see if anyone was buying his act. He wasn't rich. He was terrified. He was drowning in debt, just like the rental car outside suggested. and he was using my family as a life raft, hoping my father's phantom equity would float him. My father raised his glass. To Brad, for handling the tough decisions. I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, a dangerous, hysterical thing. I swallowed it down. If I called him out now, he'd deny it. He'd say I was jealous. He'd say I didn't know the inner workings of the C-suite. No, I needed more. I needed him to hang himself. I needed him to commit to a lie so specific, so verifiable, that there would be no escape. I unclenched my hand from the spoon and forced my face into a mask of wide-eyed admiration. I turned my chair slightly toward him, lowering my defenses. "Wow," I breathed, letting a little awe creep into my voice. "You fired a doctor. That's incredible, Brad. You must have so much authority. I can't even imagine the pressure." Brad's chest puffed out. He swallowed the bait whole. "It's heavy lies the crown daisy, but someone has to steer the ship. I have a meeting with the chiefs of staff on Tuesday to discuss the new budget cuts. I'm thinking of slashing the residency program in half, trim the fat." "The residency program," I repeated, my heart hammering a war drum against my ribs. "Tuesday. You're leading that meeting?" "Chairing it," Brad corrected, taking a swig of the cheap wine. "I'm the one holding the gavel." I nodded slowly, picking up my own glass. Tuesday. The day I was scheduled to lead the intro orientation for the new rotation. The day the chief supervisor me would be addressing the entire administrative support staff regarding new protocols. He wasn't chairing a meeting on Tuesday. He was going to be sitting in the audience of mine. "That sounds fascinating, Brad," I said, sipping the sour wine. "Please, tell us more about the hospital. I'd love to hear about the hierarchy." I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. The trap was set. The golden goose was about to cook itself. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, sounding less like a countdown to a new year and more like a metronome for my growing migraine. We had moved to the living room for the final countdown, and the atmosphere was thick with a cloying, desperate sort of hope. My parents had cornered Brad on the sofa, flanking him like two eager spaniels, while Chloe sat on the armrest, stroking his shoulder and looking at him with a gaze that was 50% adoration and 50% calculation. Brad was flushed, likely from the combination of the cheap wine and the mental gymnastics required to keep his web of lies from collapsing. He had spent the last hours spinning tales of mergers and acquisitions in the hospital cafeteria, stories that I knew for a fact were actually about the switch from Pepsi to Coke products in the vending machines. "You know," my father said, leaning forward and tapping Brad's knee, "Daisy's mother and I have been thinking. With you officially joining the family soon, maybe we could sit down next week, go over the portfolio. We've got some lingering liabilities. The house mostly. We were hoping a man with your financial acumen could help us restructure." Brad loosened his tie, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. "Absolutely, Frank. Absolutely. We can leverage the equity. I do it all the time with the hospital's assets. Move a few million here, hide a few losses there. It's all a shell game, really." My mother sighed contentedly, looking at me with that familiar, pitying smile. "See, Daisy? This is what ambition looks like. Brad is going to lift our burdens. He's going to make sure we're all taken care of. You know, sweetie, don't worry about the loans. I'm sure once Brad settles in, he can maybe help you out, or at least give you some advice on how to declare bankruptcy gracefully." That was it. The final straw. It wasn't the insult to my career. It was the sheer dangerous delusion of it all. They were about to hand their retirement, their home, their safety over to a man who I was fairly certain stole office supplies to save money. I looked at the TV where the ball was 5 minutes from dropping. I looked at my sister, who was beaming at a fraud. I looked at Brad, who was currently checking his phone, probably to see if his credit card had been declined for the champagne. I stood up. The movement was sudden enough that the room went quiet. "Actually," I said, my voice calm, cutting through the hum of the television, "I have a gift for the family, since we're talking about the future and careers." My mother frowned. "Oh, Daisy. We said no gifts. We're saving money, remember? Or well, we were until Brad came along. I ignored her. I reached into my purse, bypassing the wallet and the keys, and pulled out the one thing I had been told to hide. I walked over to the coffee table right in front of where Brad was sitting and placed the object down with a soft clack. It was a hard plastic ID badge fresh from the printer. The lamination was still sharp. The photo was unflattering as all hospital IDs are, but the text was bold and undeniable. Daisy Wagner, Chief Residency Supervisor, Administrative Oversight. I know you guys think I've been finding myself for the last 8 years, I said, looking directly at my father. But I haven't. I've been working 80-hour weeks, and on Friday I was promoted. My parents stared at the badge. My father squinted, trying to read the small print without his glasses. Supervisor, he muttered. What does that mean, like, you supervise the nurses? No, Dad? I said, turning my body slowly toward Brad. I supervise the residents, and I oversee the scheduling for the support staff, including the administrative wing. I locked eyes with Brad. For a second, he just blinked, a confused smile frozen on his face. He hadn't put it together yet. To him, I was still Chloe's loser sister. That's nice, Daisy, Brad said, his voice dripping with condescension. Middle management is a good start. Keep grinding. St. Jude's General. I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into the tone I used when a resident was about to kill a patient. That's where you work, right, Brad? The North Wing, 3rd floor? Brad's smile faltered. The color began to drain from his face, leaving him a sickly, pasty white. He knew the North Wing. That was the administrative block. Yeah, he croaked. Yeah, that's my turf. I took a step closer. It's funny, I continued, because I was reviewing the staffing rosters this morning for the entire department. I like to know who's working under me, and I saw a name that looked familiar. Bradley Jenkins, Junior Scheduler, Grade 3. The silence in the room was absolute. The TV counted down 3 minutes, but no one looked. Brad was paralyzed. His eyes darted from my face to the ID badge on the table. He looked at the photo, then back at me. And then I saw it. The recognition. It hit him like a physical blow. He didn't see Daisy anymore. He saw the woman the interns called the Terminator, the supervisor who had famously made a third-year resident cry for miscalculating a dosage by a decimal point. He saw his boss, his boss's boss. Dr. Wagner, he whispered. The glass of wine in his hand tipped, spilling a dark red stain onto his shiny blue trousers. He didn't even notice. Junior Scheduler, I repeated, relentless. That's entry-level Brad. You handle the janitorial PTO requests and the cafeteria supply orders. You don't chair meetings. You don't fire doctors. In fact, according to the file I read, you're currently on a performance improvement plan for chronic lateness and misuse of the company copier. My mother let out a small, confused squeak. Daisy, what are you saying? Brad runs the hospital. He said he fired Dr. Henderson. I didn't look away from him. Tell them, Brad. Tell them who Dr. Henderson is. Brad was shaking now, visibly shaking. The confident visionary had dissolved into a puddle of terrified clerk. He stood up, knocking his knees against the coffee table. I didn't know, he stammered, backing away from me. I didn't know you were her. Oh God, please don't fire me. I have the rent due next week. Rent? My father barked, standing up. What rent? You own a condo downtown. You showed us the pictures. Brad looked at my father, then at Chloe, his face crumbling. It's a Zillow listing, Frank. I rent a studio in the basement of my cousin's house. I'm sorry. I wanted to impress Chloe. She said you guys liked success. I thought if I acted the part, maybe you'd help me with the car payments. The room spun. The golden goose wasn't just a turkey, he was a starving pigeon. My sister let out a gasp that sounded like a balloon deflating. You're broke, she screeched. You're broke and you're a scheduler. You told me you were buying me a Range Rover. I can't buy a Range Rover, Chloe, Brad yelled, his voice cracking. I can barely buy a sandwich. That's why I needed your parents to invest. I have $40,000 in credit card debt because of these suits and the dinners. He turned back to me, clasping his hands together like he was praying. Dr. Wagner, please. I'll do anything. I'll work weekends. I'll scrub the floors. Just don't terminate me. I know your reputation. I know you don't tolerate fluff. My father sat down heavily, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. He looked at the private reserve wine bottle, then at the rental car outside, and finally at me. The realization was washing over him in cold, hard waves. He had mocked the daughter who had just conquered the medical board to fawn over a boy who filed paperwork for a living. You're the supervisor, my dad asked quietly, pointing at my badge. You're his boss. I'm the boss of the guy who tells him when he's allowed to take a lunch break, I clarified. And right now, Brad, you're on very thin ice. Impersonating an executive, lying about hospital operations, that's grounds for immediate dismissal. Brad looked like he was about to faint. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I wanted to be somebody. The TV in the background erupted. 10:98. The ball was dropping. Confetti was flying on the screen. In the living room, the illusion had shattered into a million pieces. There would be no boat. There would be no payoff of the mortgage. There was just a liar in a cheap suit, a stunned family, and a doctor who was finally undeniably in charge. Happy New Year. I thought, crossing my arms as the cheers erupted on television. Code blue in the living room. The television was the only thing in the room that hadn't gotten the memo that the party was over. On screen, a million people in Times Square were kissing and waving foam noodles, screaming into the void of a new year, while Auld Lang Syne played with a cheerful, brassy optimism that felt almost violent against the silence of our living room. My father was slumped in his armchair, looking like a man who had just bet the farm on a three-legged horse and watched it trip out of the gate. My mother was frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, staring at the stain of cheap wine spreading across the beige carpet, a stain caused by the millionaire she had spent the last 4 hours eulogizing. And then there was Brad. Poor, sweaty, terrified Brad. He stood by the coffee table, vibrating with the kind of kinetic energy usually seen in prey animals, realizing there is no exit. He looked at me, then at the spilled wine, then back at me. I can get that, he squeaked. I know the protocol for spills. Blot don't rub. Dr. Wagner, I can fix this. The protocol for spills? I repeated, my voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was the only thing anyone had said in 2 minutes. The absurdity of it seemed to snap Brad into a different mode, his default mode. The executive persona evaporated, replaced instantly by the junior admin muscle memory. He dropped to his knees, not to beg, but to frantically dab at the carpet with a cocktail napkin. I'll get some club soda, he muttered to himself, scrambling up and rushing toward the kitchen. Club soda lifts the tannins. I'll handle it, doctor. Please don't write me up. The sight of him, the man who had just promised to refinance my parents' house, sprinting to fetch cleaning supplies like a frightened intern, was almost funny. Almost. But the air in the room was too heavy for laughter. It was thick with the smog of shattered expectations. Chloe was the first to break the human silence. She let out a sob that sounded like a hiccup, then another, until she was fully weeping, her face buried in her hands. It wasn't a pretty cry. It was the ugly, jagged crying of someone who has been caught playing dress-up. I just wanted to win, she choked out, her voice muffled by her palms. I just wanted to win one time, Daisy. I looked at her standing there in her red velvet dress that probably still had the tag tucked in the back so she could return it tomorrow. Win? I asked. Win what, Chloe? This isn't a game show. It's our lives. She looked up, mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivets. You don't get it. You were always the smart one. Daisy's going to be a doctor. Daisy's studying. Daisy's going to save the world. What was I? I was just Chloe. I work at a boutique, Daisy. I sell scarves to women who look at me like I'm furniture. I wanted to bring someone home who mattered. I wanted Mom and Dad to look at me the way they look at their bank statements, with interest. My mother made a small, pained noise. Chloe, honey, that's not true. But it was true. We all knew it was true. My parents had treated Brad like a golden idol, not because they liked him, but because he represented the one thing they valued more than my medical license, a shortcut. They wanted the easy out. They wanted the visionary who could wave a magic wand and erase their bad decisions, rather than the daughter who was offering the slow, unglamorous solution of hard work and discipline. Brad returned from the kitchen armed with a roll of paper towels and a bottle of seltzer, looking manic. "I'm scrubbing it," he announced, dropping to his knees again. "I'm scrubbing it right now. See, proactive problem solving." He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "This shows initiative, right, Dr. Wagner? This counts toward my quarterly review." I stared down at him, watching him frantically attack the carpet. The financier, who was going to buy a boat, was now asking for credit for cleaning a rug. It was pathetic, but in a way it was the most honest thing he had done all night. "Stop scrubbing, Brad," I said, my tone softening just a fraction. "You're going to ruin the fibers." He froze, hands hovering over the stain. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." I sighed and turned to my parents. My father finally looked at me. His face was gray, stripped of the arrogance he'd worn earlier when mocking my student loans. "He really doesn't have the money, does he?" Dad asked, his voice hollow. "The investment, the restructuring. He has 40,000 in debt and a leased Jetta," I said brutally. "There is no money, Dad. There never was." My father put his head in his hands. "We were counting on it," he whispered. "The second mortgage resets in February. We thought he was the answer." "That's the problem," I said, stepping into the center of the room. This was it. The moment the dynamic shifted permanently. I wasn't the child anymore. "You guys have been looking for a lottery ticket. You looked at my debt, my student loans, and you saw a mistake. You saw a burden. You made fun of me for taking the slow path. But let me tell you something about that debt." I gestured to the ID badge still sitting on the table, glinting under the lights. "That debt isn't a mistake. It's an investment. It's the cost of buying a future that actually exists. I didn't look for a rich husband to save me. I bet on myself. I took the hit, I did the work, and now I have a career that no one can take away from me. Not a bank, not a bad economy, and certainly not a scheduling error." I looked at Chloe, then at my parents. "You wanted the fantasy. You wanted the medical financier because it sounded easy. But the reality is, the only doctor in this room, the only person who can actually write a check that won't bounce, is the one you've been ignoring all night." The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of shame. My mother looked down at her hands. My father stared at the wall. They were realizing that while they were busy polishing the brass on a sinking ship, I had been quietly building a lifeboat. "I'm not rich," I continued, my voice steady. "I have loans. I drive a beat-up car. I eat cafeteria food, but I am solid. I am real. And in this family that needs to start counting for more than a shiny suit and a rental car." I looked down at Brad, who was still kneeling on the floor holding the seltzer bottle like a talisman. "Get up, Brad," I said. "You're not firing anyone, and you're not buying anyone a Range Rover, but you are going to finish the dishes. Because if there's one thing we value in this hospital and in this house, it's cleaning up your own mess." Brad scrambled to his feet, nodding so hard I thought his head might detach. "Dishes. Yes, I'm great at dishes. I'm on it, Dr. Wagner." He practically ran to the dining room, eager to be useful, eager to be anything other than the fraud he had been 5 minutes ago. As the clatter of plates began in the other room, the tension in the living room finally broke, replaced by a cold, sobering reality. The party was over, but the work was just beginning. The sound of aggressive dishwashing from the kitchen provided a strange, rhythmic soundtrack to the silence in the living room. It was the sound of penance clinking porcelain and splashing water, and it seemed to lower the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. My father let out a long, shuddering breath, the kind that seems to deflate the lungs entirely. He walked over to the fireplace, leaning his arm against the mantel, looking older than he had an hour ago. The bluster was gone. The man of the house posturing had evaporated, leaving behind just Frank, a retiree terrified of outliving his savings. "Daisy," he said, not turning around, I think we owe you an apology." It was a stiff sentence, rusty from lack of use, but it hung in the air with undeniable weight. He turned to face me, his eyes wet. "I was scared, honey. That's the truth of it. The market is down, the pension isn't what it used to be, and I look at the numbers at night, and I don't see how we make it to 80. When Brad showed up with his stories, I didn't want to check the facts. I wanted to believe in the fairy tale because the reality was keeping me awake at night." My mother nodded, dabbing at her eyes with one of the guest-only napkins. "We put that pressure on you," she admitted softly. "We made you feel small so he would look big. And that was wrong. You've been working yourself to the bone saving lives, and we were treating you like a disappointment." She reached out and took my hand, her grip tight. "We are so proud of you, Dr. Wagner. We really are. We were just too blinded by the glare of fool's gold to say it." I squeezed her hand back. The anger that had fueled me all night began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. They weren't villains. They were just scared people looking for a savior. "I know, Mom," I said. "Mom, But you don't need a savior. You have a family, and we fix things. We don't wish them away." I turned to Chloe. She was sitting on the sofa, picking at a loose thread on her velvet dress, looking like a deflated balloon. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I walked over and sat next to her, grabbing the bottle of Cuvée de l'Ombre from the coffee table. I poured 2 glasses, filling them to the brim. "Here," I said, shoving one into her hand. "Drink up. It tastes like vinegar and bad decisions, but it's paid for." Chloe let out a wet, snorting laugh, finally looking at me. "I feel so stupid," she whispered. "I really believed him. I thought he was special." "He is special," I said dryly. "He's the only man I know who would try to clean a carpet with club soda in a $3,000 suit. Look, Chloe, you don't need a guy with a fake portfolio to make you valuable. You're my sister. You're funny, you're kind, and you have better taste in clothes than anyone I know. Don't trade that in for a guy who lies about his job title." She sniffled, clinking her glass against mine. "Okay, but can we agree he's actually a really good dishwasher? Listen to him go." We both listened. The clatter from the kitchen was frantic. I stood up, smoothing down my scrubs. "Speaking of which, I need to go handle my employee." I walked into the kitchen. Brad was elbow-deep in suds, scrubbing a pot with the intensity of a surgeon performing a heart transplant. He jumped when he saw me, nearly dropping a ladle. "It's clean," he yelped. "Everything is clean. I even did the burner grates. Please, Dr. Wagner, I really need this job. I'll transfer departments. I'll go to the basement records room. You'll never see me." He looked so pathetic, so genuinely terrified that the last of my vindictiveness vanished. He was a liar, yes, but he was also a desperate kid trying to survive in a world that demanded success at any cost. "Relax, Brad," I said, leaning against the counter. "I'm not going to fire you." His knees visibly buckled with relief. You're not—" "No," I said sternly. "But here are the new terms. You stop lying. To my sister, to my parents, and to the staff. You go back to work on Wednesday, you clock in on time, and you actually do your job. And if I hear one more story about you firing a doctor, I will personally assign you to the proctology clinic for 6 months. Do we understand each other?" Brad saluted. He actually saluted. "Yes, ma'am. Crystal clear, ma'am. I love scheduling. It's my passion." "Good," I said. "Now grab a towel, we're not done." I called out to the living room. "Mom, Dad, Chloe, get in here. If we're going to be a family, we're going to clean up this mess together." And they did. For the first time in years, the Wagner family operated as a unit. My father dried the plates, my mother put away the leftovers, Chloe swept the floor, and Brad scrubbed the sink until it shone. There were no more delusions of grandeur, no more talk of boats or private reserves. There was just the simple, honest work of putting a house in order. When the kitchen was spotless, we stood around the island, tired but lighter. My father poured the last of the cheap wine into 5 glasses, one for each of us, including Brad. He raised his glass, looking at me with a newfound respect. To Dr. Daisy Wagner, he said, his voice steady. The head of the table. I shook my head, smiling. No, Dad. To reality. It's not as shiny, but it lasts longer. We clinked glasses, the sound ringing out like a bell. The new year had officially begun. The doctor was in, the debt was real, and for the first time in a long time, everything was going to be okay. And just like that, the Wagners learned that a shiny suit doesn't make a man, and honest work beats a hollow promise every time. If you enjoyed this reality check, please hit that subscribe button and share your own family holiday disaster stories below. We read every single comment of your thoughts and love hearing from you. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.